All right, welcome back. Today, we are diving into one of the most fundamental questions in all of public policy, and we're doing it through a brilliant paper that won the Frisch Medal back in 2000. Richard Blundell, Alan Duncan, and Costas Meghir, they didn't just answer a question. They handed economists a brand new, powerful toolkit for understanding how real people, actually respond to economic incentives. So let's break down how they did it.
So, here's the big question. If taxes change, how much do people really change how much they work? It sounds so simple, doesn't it? A government wants to cut taxes or maybe raise them, and they desperately need to know, are people going to work more or less, or will they do nothing at all? The answer to this is everything. It determines if tax cuts can pay for themselves, it shapes how we design welfare programs, it's all about balancing fairness and efficiency. And believe me, this isn't just some dusty academic puzzle. This is a high-stakes question with billion-dollar consequences.
So here's our game plan for today. We're going to start with why this question matters so much, why it's a billion-dollar question. Then, we'll meet the main villain of our story, the dreaded identification problem. But don't worry, we'll uncover an unexpected clue from a series of huge tax reforms in the UK. We'll see how our heroes used a breakthrough method to connect economic theory with hard reality, which led to a new gold standard in findings and a legacy that is still shaping policy right now.
Okay, let's start with the stakes. Because getting the answer to our question right, well, it's not just about tweaking a few numbers on some government spreadsheet. It has massive, real-world consequences for everyone.
I mean, think about it. The answer tells policymakers how to design what they hope is an optimal tax system. It guides them in structuring welfare programs to encourage work without leaving the vulnerable behind. It is the absolute bedrock of forecasting government revenues. If you get it wrong, a tax cut that was supposed to juice the economy could just blow a giant hole in the budget. At its very core, this helps us understand that fundamental trade-off between making the whole economic pie bigger and figuring out how to slice it up fairly.
So if this question is so important, why is it so darn hard to answer? Well, this brings us to the central challenge, the big boss at the end of the level for pretty much all of empirical economics, the identification problem.
Okay, imagine you're a detective at a crime scene. Everybody has a motive, everybody's fingerprints are everywhere, and a dozen things happened all at once. How do you figure out what caused what? That, right there, is the identification problem. In the real world, sure, people who work more tend to earn higher wages, but did the high wages cause them to work more? Or are people who are just naturally more driven and ambitious more likely to both work more and command higher wages? It's almost impossible to untangle that knot of cause and effect just by looking at the data.
To make it even trickier, a single tax cut is actually pulling you in two opposite directions at the same time. On one hand, you have the substitution effect. This makes working more attractive. Each hour you work now buys you more cool stuff, so the price of taking an hour off to relax has gone up. You substitute work for leisure. But at the exact same time, the income effect kicks in. Because you're richer overall, you can afford to buy more of everything, and that includes leisure time, so you might actually decide to work less. These two forces are in a constant tug-of-war, and we can't tell which one is winning just by watching what people do.
So the key, the absolute holy grail here, is to find a situation where people's wages or their incentives to work change for reasons that have nothing to do with their own personal choices or skills or ambition. We need what economists call an exogenous shock, some big outside event that smacks the system and lets us see the pure, unconfounded effect of that change.
And that brings us to the breakthrough moment. Blundell, Duncan, and Meghir realized that history had basically just handed them the perfect clue on a silver platter. A series of absolutely massive, politically driven tax reforms in the United Kingdom during the 1980s.
I mean, just look at these numbers. These are not small tweaks. We're talking about the top marginal tax rate getting slashed by more than half in less than a decade, from a jaw-dropping 83% all the way down to 40%. The basic rate that most people paid also fell quite a bit. These changes were huge, and they weren't happening because of any one person's work ethic. No. These were sweeping policy shifts that created a perfect natural experiment, changing the financial incentives for millions of people all at once.
And this is kind of what those big policy changes look like for an individual person trying to make a choice. The decision of how much to work isn't a smooth, straight line. It's this complicated, kinked landscape made up of different tax brackets and benefit cutoffs. So when the government changes the basic tax rate, for example, it moves one of these kinks. By watching how people's choices bunch up around these kinks before and after the reforms, the researchers could finally start to isolate the true effect of the policy change itself.
Okay, so we've got our clue, this amazing natural experiment. But now we need the right forensic tool to analyze it. And this is where the paper's true genius really shines through. They didn't just do a simple before and after comparison. Oh no, they did something much, much more clever. See, a simple analysis, what we might call reduced form, would just ask, so what happened to average work hours after the tax cut? And that's useful, but it's limited. What these authors did was use structural estimation. This goes way deeper. It asks the question, why did it happen? It builds a model of human behavior using economic theory to actually estimate those underlying income and substitution effects we talked about earlier. By combining the real-world data from the tax experiment with a serious theoretical model, they could finally separate those two warring forces. And a really critical part of their model was making a distinction between two totally different types of decisions people make. Think of the intensive margin as a dimmer switch. You're already working, and you just decide to dial your hours up or down a little bit. But the extensive margin, that's the main on-off switch. That's the huge decision to either get a job and enter the workforce in the first place or to leave it entirely. And as we're about to see, that little distinction turned out to be everything.
So, the detective work is done. The evidence has been analyzed with these new tools. What was the verdict? Well, the paper's findings were crystal clear, incredibly powerful, and in some ways, really surprising. This table really lays it all out. When people's after-tax wages went up, what actually changed the most? Well, for men without kids, not a whole lot. But just look at women, especially those with young children. The biggest effect, by a long shot, was on the decision to work at all. That's the extensive margin, our on-off switch. Their participation in the labor force was super responsive to these new incentives. But for people who are already working, across the board, the effect on the number of hours they worked, that intensive margin, our dimmer switch, was actually pretty small.
So the big takeaway here is that incentives matter most when it comes to flipping that on-off switch from off to on. For secondary earners in a household, which at that time was often women with children, the decision to even enter the workforce was heavily influenced by tax policy. But for people already in a job, the decision to maybe stay a little later or leave a little earlier turns out that wasn't nearly as sensitive to the tax changes.
And look, this wasn't just some other paper published in a journal. It fundamentally changed how economists even approach policy analysis. It basically created a new blueprint, a new gold standard for how to do credible empirical work in public finance. Its legacy is just immense. Today, governments use these sophisticated simulation models built on this exact kind of structural estimation to forecast the effects of tax changes. It became the foundation for evaluating huge welfare reforms. Think about a program like the Earned Income Tax Credit in the US. It is specifically designed to get people to flip that on-off switch to on. And that's a direct policy application of the insights from this paper. It really did bridge that gap between abstract economic theory and the messy, complicated world of real policy evaluation. And that leaves us with this final, really powerful idea. Blundell, Duncan, and Meghir taught the entire profession to see the world in a new way. A major policy shift isn't just a political event, it's an opportunity. It's an accidental experiment that, if you have the right tools, can reveal the deep underlying principles of how we all respond to incentives. And understanding that behavior, well, that's the first and most important step to creating smarter, more effective policy for everyone.